I walked out of my parents' anniversary and destroyed their perfect image, and I don't regret it. And then, when my parents announced they were throwing themselves a grand 50th wedding anniversary party, I should have known things would end in disaster, but I let myself hope this time might be different. My mother, Diane, had always been the kind of woman who cared more about appearances than feelings, and my father, Walter, mostly went along with whatever she wanted as long as it kept the peace. I was used to being the middle child who smoothed over the cracks, but something deep inside me believed maybe, just maybe, now that we were all older, we could finally have a celebration that didn't feel like a performance. They chose a historic estate outside of Albany for the event, with sprawling gardens and a ballroom that had been in magazines. They hired a planner who used phrases like statement florals and insisted on having a champagne wall. My older brother Greg, who lived in Boston and worked in finance, praised every extravagant choice, calling it a fitting tribute to our parents' legacy. My younger sister Lila, who had just had her second baby, seemed more hesitant, but she agreed to chip in her share of the costs. We were each asked to contribute 10 grand toward the event, a number that made me wince, but I paid without complaint. I tried to focus on the idea that this was a chance to finally do something together that wasn't weighed down by the usual tension. My husband Victor, always steady and supportive, reassured me that it would be worth it if it brought the family closer. Ellie, my daughter, was thrilled when she got the invitation. She'd just finished a tough semester at her college in Denver and was excited to see everyone again, convinced that this time her grandparents would see her for who she really was. She saved up her own money for the plane ticket, even skipped out on a weekend trip with friends to make sure she could come. She spent hours working on a custom gift, a silver picture frame she engraved herself with their initials and the date of the event. She kept showing it to me in the weeks leading up to the trip, her face glowing with hope that this would mean something. The day of the party arrived, hot and cloudless, the kind of day that made you sweat just by breathing. We got to the estate early so I could help with last-minute details and make sure everything went smoothly. I watched my mother direct the staff like a general before battle, adjusting the placement of candles and fussing with tablecloths. My father followed behind her with a clipboard, like he was afraid someone might try to steal the schedule and ruin everything. Victor stayed close, trying to keep me calm while wrangling our younger kids, who were already bored and asking when they could go home. I kept checking my phone for updates from Ellie, who was supposed to land just before noon. The ceremony was set for 2, and I kept reassuring myself she'd make it. Planes ran late all the time, I told myself, and she'd promised to head straight from the airport. As the minutes ticked past, my stomach started doing that awful thing where it felt both too light and impossibly heavy at the same time. I found myself scanning the long driveway every few seconds, willing her to appear. Victor handed me a cup of punch, lukewarm and sickly sweet, and I took a sip without tasting it. I tried to act relaxed for the sake of the kids, but every glance at my phone made my heart pound harder. Finally, unable to stand the waiting anymore, I found my mother near the back patio. She was adjusting a centerpiece, her face calm and collected like she was hosting a royal gala instead of a family party. I forced a smile, though I felt anything but calm. I asked if we could wait a few more minutes before starting, explaining that Ellie was cutting it close but should be there any second. My mother didn't even look surprised. She turned to me, smoothing the tablecloth as if the conversation were no big deal, and said the words that made my blood run cold. She told me Ellie had already been there. She said Ellie arrived before noon, and they told her it wasn't appropriate for her to stay. I thought I misheard her at first, laughed in shock, waiting for the inevitable, "I'm joking." But that moment never came. My father chimed in like he'd been waiting for his turn, arms crossed, and confirmed it. They told her it was a family-only event, and she wasn't part of the family in the way they meant. I stared at both of them, waiting for the punchline, but all I saw were 2 people who'd convinced themselves they were in the right. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. Ellie had flown all that way, spent every last dollar she had, and they'd sent her away like an unwanted guest. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. Something inside me broke so quietly that I barely noticed it at first. I just turned to Victor, told the kids to gather their things, and said we were leaving. My mother's eyes widened, like she couldn't believe I'd actually walk out. She told me not to be dramatic, tried to smooth it over with that fake sweet tone she always used when she wanted to shut down a conversation. but I was done listening. We left the estate, the grand celebration still going on behind us, and I didn't look back once. The air outside felt heavier than it should have, thick with the kind of heat that sticks to your skin and makes every breath feel like work. We walked across the gravel path, Victor carrying the bags we had barely unpacked, while the kids trailed behind, quiet and confused. I kept trying to call Ellie, my fingers shaking so badly that I could barely tap the screen, but every call went straight to voicemail, and each unanswered ring made my heart sink deeper. We reached the car, and Victor opened the doors without a word, helping the kids climb in while I stood there gripping my phone like it might somehow make this nightmare end. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, my screen lit up with a message from Ellie. All it said was, "Are you free now?" That single line said more than any long speech could have, and my stomach twisted with guilt and rage as I dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice small and trying to sound steady, but I could hear the tremble beneath it. She told me she didn't want to ruin anything, that she thought maybe it was better to let the day go on without more drama. I could barely speak past the lump in my throat as I told her she hadn't ruined a thing, that she'd done nothing wrong, and that what had happened was entirely on them. She told me she was at a cafe down the road, the only place she could think of to go, and Victor had already started the car before I even finished telling him where she was. The drive was silent, the kind of silence that feels too loud because of everything you want to say but can't. When we pulled up to the cafe, I saw her sitting by the window, hands wrapped around a mug of something that was probably stone cold by then. She looked up when she saw us, blinking like she wasn't sure we were real, like maybe part of her hadn't expected us to actually come. I got out before Victor even stopped the car completely, and I hugged her so tightly I felt her ribs against mine. She didn't pull away. She just stood there in my arms, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again. We went inside, ordered a plate of fries and some drinks that none of us touched, and sat together in that small, quiet booth like we were trying to figure out what came next. I kept my phone face down on the table, but I could feel it buzzing every few minutes. I didn't need to check to know who it was. Eventually, I picked up when Greg called, because I knew he wouldn't stop until I did. His voice came through the line sharp with anger, asking what the hell I was thinking, leaving the party like that, humiliating our parents in front of all their friends. I told him calmly that Ellie had been turned away at the door, that she flew in from Denver, spent her last savings, and they treated her like a stranger. He scoffed so loudly I had to pull the phone away from my ear, saying I was blowing things out of proportion, that I was being dramatic, that I was making everything about myself. I let him rant, listened as he tried to lay the blame at my feet, until I couldn't anymore. I told him that if a single person could ruin their big day, maybe it wasn't much of a big day to begin with. I hung up while he was still mid-sentence, my hand trembling as I set the phone down. Ellie reached over then, just lightly placing her fingers on mine. No words, just that small touch to remind me she was there. That meant more to me than anything Greg or my parents could have said. The phone kept buzzing, but I ignored it, at least until I saw my mother's name light up the screen. Victor told me I didn't have to answer, but I felt like I did. Her voice came through tight and furious, hissing that I was humiliating them, that people were asking questions, that I needed to come back before I ruined the entire night. I told her maybe she should have thought of that before slamming the door in Ellie's face, before deciding her own granddaughter wasn't worthy of being there. She tried to backpedal, saying it wasn't like that, saying I was being unfair, but I'd had enough. I hung up on her too, and when a message from Lila came through minutes later saying she and her husband were leaving the party as well, I felt the first flicker of relief I'd had all day. We weren't alone in this. We stayed at that cafe for what felt like hours, Lila and her family joining us eventually, looking just as drained and stunned as we were. We pushed a few tables together, ordered more food that no one really ate, and just sat there in that strange, heavy quiet, like we were all trying to make sense of what had happened. My phone kept lighting up with messages from other relatives, some asking if we were okay, others trying to guilt us into returning, but I didn't answer any of them. The party kept going without us, though not the way my parents had planned. One of our cousins sent updates from the scene, how the slideshow glitched, how guests started slipping out early, How my mother tried to cover for the empty seats with forced smiles and stiff speeches about family togetherness that rang hollow in the half-empty room. It should have felt like victory, I guess, seeing the perfect facade crack. But mostly it just felt sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that it had taken something this ugly for me to finally see it all clearly. Sad that my daughter had to be the one to pay the price for their pride. When the night finally ended and we drove home in the dark, the only sound was the quiet hum of the tires on the road and Ellie's soft breathing in the back seat. And I knew there was no going back. The next morning started with the kind of heavy stillness that feels almost unnatural, like the world is holding its breath while waiting to see what you'll do next. I stood in the kitchen, stirring sugar into coffee that tasted like ash, and tried to gather my thoughts while my phone vibrated endlessly on the counter beside me. I didn't want to answer it, but eventually, out of sheer exhaustion, I listened to Greg's voicemail, knowing full well what it would contain before I even pressed play. His voice poured through the speaker dripping with fury, demanding to know how I could leave him stuck with the bill for the entire event, accusing me of blowing everything out of proportion, claiming I had embarrassed the family beyond repair. He ended the message with a bitter, growling grow up, like that was supposed to be the final word that would shame me back into line. I played it twice, letting every angry syllable sink in until it lost all its sting. Then I muted the phone and went back to flipping pancakes for Ellie, who had quietly asked for them as if we could somehow make the morning feel normal again. Ellie sat at the table, her hair still damp from the shower, notebook open beside her plate where she half-heartedly doodled between bites. I could see the weight of it all sitting on her shoulders, but she wasn't complaining. She was trying to give me space to process everything while still showing me she was okay, at least as okay as she could be after what had happened. Victor sat across from her, quietly sipping his coffee and giving me that look that meant whatever you need. I'm here. By early afternoon, the knock came at the door, polite but firm, the kind of knock that lets you know the visitors aren't leaving without saying their piece. I opened it to find my parents standing there, dressed like they'd come straight from church, my mother clutching a folder to her chest like it was a peace offering, and my father wearing his blazer of dignity, as if that would lend weight to whatever they were about to say. They wanted to come inside, wanted to sit down and talk, wanted to smooth things over and explain that everything had been a misunderstanding, that of course they loved Ellie, that of course they hadn't meant to hurt her. But the words felt hollow before they even left their mouths. My mother smiled that practiced smile, the one she always used at fundraisers and garden parties, and asked if they could speak to Ellie alone, as though I might somehow be the barrier to making things right. I called Ellie down, but not because I believed anything good would come from it. I did it because I wanted her to see it for herself, to understand she hadn't imagined any of it, to know that she wasn't the one who failed that day. She came downstairs with that quiet strength I was only just beginning to appreciate, arms folded, eyes steady, and she listened as they tried to convince her that it had all been blown out of proportion. My mother spoke in soft, sweet tones, saying they'd been overwhelmed, that they hadn't meant to exclude her, that it had all been a mistake born from the chaos of the day. My father nodded along, offering nothing of substance, just his usual supportive silence that really meant he was hoping it would all be over soon. Ellie didn't cry or raise her voice. She stood there, calm and composed, and told them she wasn't angry anymore. She was just done. There was a silence that fell over the room then, the kind of silence that says more than any argument could. They tried to recover, tried to convince her to come by for dinner, to talk things through, but she only shook her head and excused herself, leaving them standing there with their practiced apologies and their empty words. I closed the door behind them, feeling for the first time like I'd actually shut them out, like I'd finally chosen something better. The fallout was faster than I expected. Words spread through the family like wildfire, the story twisted and reshaped by every retelling, until somehow Greg became the victim who was left shouldering the cost of the party while his unhinged sisters tore the family apart. My mother leaned into the role of the wronged matriarch, telling anyone who would listen that we'd misunderstood, that we'd embarrassed them, that we'd ruined what should have been their happiest day. Relatives started calling, some offering support in quiet voices, others trying to nudge us back into place, hoping to restore the image of harmony before it shattered completely. My cousin Mark texted to say he admired us for standing up, But that was quickly followed by a message from Aunt Carol asking if we couldn't just apologize for the sake of family peace. Lila sent a single line that said it all. We're really not paying our share, right? And I wrote back without hesitation, correct. Greg's rage built like a storm, each message more frantic than the last. As the invoices started rolling in and he realized the math had changed, that he was on the hook for far more than he'd planned. He called, left furious voicemails, sent emails laced with guilt and venom, but I didn't answer. I didn't have the energy to keep defending what I knew was right. In the days that followed, the cracks in my parents' perfect image deepened. Greg learned the hard truth, that the inheritance he'd been promised didn't exist, that our parents' wealth was smoke and mirrors built on loans and appearances. The house was mortgaged to the hilt, the accounts nearly empty, and all the talk of legacy had been just another part of the illusion. When Greg realized he'd been lied to just as much as we had, the fury in his voice shifted, turning inward as he struggled to accept that the people he'd defended so fiercely had played him too. The call stopped after that. The messages tapered off, and the silence that followed was louder than anything they'd said before. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad, but I also felt free, like I'd finally stepped out from under a weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for most of my life. It's strange how quiet life becomes after the storm, like the world exhales and waits for you to decide what comes next. For the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't walking on eggshells, trying to manage other people's emotions, trying to convince myself that maybe things weren't as bad as they felt. I focused on Ellie, on helping her settle back into some version of normal before her return flight to Denver. She spent those days helping Victor with small repairs around the house, sketching on the back porch, and checking in on Lila's kids when we visited. I watched her laugh with her cousins, watched her fold into the spaces where she was welcome, and realized just how much I'd let my parents shape the narrative for too long. One afternoon, about a week after the anniversary debacle, I found myself standing at the kitchen sink, staring out at the yard while Victor painted the fence. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I ignored it at first, unwilling to break the calm. But when it kept vibrating, I glanced at the screen and saw Greg's name again. I didn't want to hear his voice, but curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. His tone was different this time, not angry, not accusing, just tired, worn down by everything he'd discovered. He didn't bother with small talk. He went straight into it, telling me how our parents' finances were a mess, how everything they'd claimed to have was a house of cards. He said he felt like an idiot for believing in the promises, for thinking there was some grand inheritance waiting for him after all those years of loyalty. I listened, feeling a complicated mix of sympathy and resentment, because as much as I wanted to comfort him, I couldn't forget how hard he'd tried to make me the villain. Greg admitted he was done covering for them, that he'd been paying their bills out of guilt, out of obligation, but he couldn't do it anymore. He said they were on their own now, that he'd finally seen through the act. When he hung up, I stood there for a long time, the weight of it all pressing down on me, not because I wanted to fix it, but because I finally understood just how deep the damage ran. Weeks passed, and the silence stretched longer. My parents stopped trying to reach out, at least directly. Instead, they leaned on other relatives to be their messengers, hoping to shame us into making amends. Aunt Carol left voicemails about family unity. Cousin Brian emailed me long, rambling thoughts on forgiveness and duty. None of it changed how I felt, and none of it reached Ellie, who had grown quieter about the whole thing but firmer in her resolve. When Ellie finally returned to school, I stood at the airport watching her walk toward security, backpack slung over one shoulder, chin lifted just enough to show me she was okay. She turned back once, offered me a small, brave smile, and then she was gone. The house felt emptier without her, but it also felt lighter, like we'd cleared out something toxic and were finally able to breathe again. Then, out of nowhere, my parents showed up at our door again. It was early on a Saturday, the sky still gray with morning fog, and I saw them through the window before they knocked. Victor asked if I wanted him to answer it, but I shook my head. I opened the door to find them standing there with matching expressions of forced calm. My mother holding a tin of cookies like that could somehow make things right. They didn't waste time. They launched straight into their pitch, telling me how sorry they were, how they missed us, how Walter's health wasn't what it used to be. My mother's voice trembled just enough to seem sincere, but I'd heard enough of her performances over the years to recognize the cracks. They wanted to talk, wanted to clear the air, wanted to start fresh before it was too late. I let them talk, standing in the doorway with my arms crossed, until my mother finally asked if we could all sit down and discuss things properly. I told them they could come in only if they were willing to speak honestly, no more half-truths or deflections. They agreed, and we sat at the kitchen table, the tension thick enough to choke on. My mother tried to steer the conversation toward forgiveness, toward family duty, but I stopped her. I told them I needed to understand why they had done what they did, why they had treated Ellie like she was less than, why they had always made me feel like I was standing outside looking in. My father spoke first, his voice low and weary, admitting that they'd been wrong, that they'd let their pride and their need for control ruin what should have been a celebration. He said they never meant to hurt Ellie, that they'd been caught up in the chaos of the day. My mother nodded along, tears in her eyes, but I could tell it wasn't regret for what they'd done. It was regret for what they'd lost. When they finished, I sat there for a long moment, then told them I appreciated the words but didn't believe they'd truly changed. I said forgiveness wasn't something you earned with cookies and apologies when things fell apart. It was something you built slowly, with real effort and accountability, and they hadn't done the work. They tried to argue, to tell me I was being cruel, but I stood up and ended it, showing them to the door with more peace than I thought I'd feel. That night, I told Victor the first felt like I'd finally closed a chapter I'd been trapped in for decades. We sat together on the back porch, watching the stars come out, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the old pull of guilt or the weight of trying to make things right for people who didn't want to meet me halfway. I knew it wasn't over, that there would be more calls, more attempts to rewrite the story, but I also knew I wouldn't answer, not this time. This time, I was done. 2 years slipped past faster than I could have imagined, the kind of time that heals just enough to let you breathe but leaves the scars where you can still feel them. Ellie finished school and settled into a small apartment downtown, one of those places that somehow managed to be charming despite its creaky floors and drafty windows. She sent pictures of her artwork, little glimpses of the life she was building, and each message reminded me that walking away had been the right thing. Lila and I stayed close, closer than we'd been since we were kids, the shared experience of seeing our parents for who they truly were knitting us together in a way nothing else ever had. Victor and I focused on small joys, weekend trips, backyard projects, dinners where we laughed until our sides hurt. There were moments when I thought about my parents, when the weight of everything that had happened would press down on me in quiet hours, but those moments came less often, and when they did, I let them pass like summer storms. Then, just as life began to feel stable, the call came that shattered the fragile peace we'd built. It was my mother's voice on the line, soft and trembling, telling me Walter was gravely ill, that he didn't have much time left, that his final wish was to see me and Ellie one more time before it was too late. I felt my breath catch, the years of conditioning tugging at my heart, the part of me that still wanted to be the good daughter, the one who showed up when it mattered. I called Ellie immediately, my hand shaking as I tried to explain the situation. She listened quietly, then asked if I believed it. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe it, wanted to think that maybe, finally, they understood the damage they'd done. But another part of me, the part that had stood in that cafe and watched my daughter hold herself together after being cast out, couldn't trust them. Ellie agreed to go, but only because she said she needed to see it for herself, needed to know if it was real or just another game. We packed overnight bags and made the drive out to the small-town hospital where my mother said they were waiting. The roads felt endless, lined with trees that blurred together as the miles passed. Neither of us spoke much during the drive, both of us lost in thoughts we didn't know how to say aloud. When we finally pulled into the hospital lot, my stomach knotted so tightly I thought I might be sick. Inside, the nurse at the front desk gave me a puzzled look when I asked for Walter's room. She checked the records twice, then told me there was no patient by that name admitted, that no one matching his description had been treated there in months. My heart sank, a cold wave of realization washing over me as I thanked her and turned back to Ellie, who had already guessed the truth. We found them in a diner 2 blocks away, seated at a corner booth like they were waiting for a meeting. My mother's face lit up when she saw us, but I saw through it now, saw the desperation behind the smile, the fear that this might be the last chance to pull us back into their orbit. Walter looked healthy, maybe a little tired, but not at all the dying man we'd been led to believe we were rushing to see. My mother launched into her speech, telling us how hard things had been, how they'd been struggling since we left, how much they missed us and needed our support. She spoke of forgiveness, of starting fresh, of putting the past behind us for the sake of family. But the words rang hollow, empty promises wrapped in the same manipulation they'd always used. Ellie didn't say a word at first. She just sat there, listening with that quiet strength I'd come to admire, letting them reveal themselves without interruption. When my mother finally finished, Ellie looked her straight in the eye and said she was sorry it had come to this, but we wouldn't be coming back. She said we'd made our peace, that we were done trying for people who didn't try for us, that it was time to let it go. The shock on my mother's face would have hurt once, would have torn me apart, but now it felt like the closing of a book I no longer needed to read. We stood, paid for our coffees, and walked out, leaving them behind in that booth, still clinging to the belief that they could rewrite the story if they just spoke the right words. The drive home felt lighter, the miles slipping by like water, the tension that had built for so long finally breaking apart. When we pulled into the driveway, Victor was waiting on the porch, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were exactly where we were supposed to be. Months passed, and the silence from my parents stretched on. No more calls, no more surprise visits, just the distant echo of what had once been. Then, one cold autumn morning, there was a knock at the door, and when I opened it, Greg was standing there, looking older than I remembered, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He told me the money had run out, that the promises had been lies, that everything he'd worked so hard to protect had been built on sand. He asked if we would help, if we'd step in and shoulder the burden that had finally fallen on him alone. I didn't even hesitate. I told him no, told him it wasn't ours to fix, told him we'd already done all we could. He left without a fight, without the usual venom, because I think, deep down, he knew it was the only answer we had left to give. In the end, they lost what mattered most, not because we turned away, but because they pushed us out, convinced they could always pull us back when they needed us. The last time I heard about them, they'd sold the house, moved into a small apartment, and cut ties with the people they once called friends, too ashamed to admit how far they'd fallen. I thought I'd feel satisfaction when that day came, but mostly, I felt relief, the kind that comes from knowing you made the right choice, even when it hurt. We didn't go too far. We went just far enough to save ourselves, to build something better, to choose peace over chaos. And if I had it to do over again, I'd choose the same every single time.